When Clark Gable's estate was finally settled in 1987, 27 years after his death, his grandson found a locked drawer in an antique desk that had belonged to the actor since his MGM days. Inside was a single envelope, sealed with red wax, addressed in faded ink, to be opened only after everyone involved is gone. The envelope contained 3 items: a photograph of Jean Harlow that had never been published, a handwritten letter in her distinctive script, and a small key attached to a tag marked Bank of America, Vault 447, Hollywood Branch. The photograph showed Jean in a way the world had never seen her. Pregnant. 6 months pregnant by the look of it, standing in what appeared to be a private garden, her hand resting protectively on her belly, her expression somewhere between terror and hope. The letter was dated March 1933, 4 years before her death. It began, "Clark, I'm writing this because if anything happens to me, someone needs to know the truth. They're going to make me choose, and I already know which choice will destroy me." The affair started the way most Hollywood disasters do, with chemistry that was too real for the camera to contain. Jean Harlow and Clark Gable met on the set of Red Dust in 1932. She was 21, already a star but still unformed, still figuring out how to survive in a system designed to consume her. He was 31, ruggedly handsome, beginning his ascent to becoming the king of Hollywood. Their on-screen dynamic was electric, raw sexuality mixed with genuine affection, the kind of connection that made audiences lean forward in their seats. Off-screen, it became something else entirely, something neither of them had permission to feel. Jane was married to Paul Byrne at the time, MGM's production executive, a man 22 years her senior, whom the studio had essentially arranged for her to marry. Byrne was cultured, intellectual, safe. He was supposed to rehabilitate Jane's image, transform her from a platinum-haired sex symbol into a respectable actress. The marriage was a publicity strategy that happened to involve a wedding license. Gable was married too, to Rhea Langham, a wealthy socialite who'd helped finance his early career. His marriage was a business arrangement that had calcified into mutual resentment. On set, between takes, Jean and Clark would disappear into her dressing room. The crew knew, the director knew, everyone knew, and everyone stayed silent because MGM had invested too much in both of them to let a scandal derail the production. But here's the detail that historians always omit. They fell in love. Not the performative Hollywood version of love, but the real thing. Messy, inconvenient, impossible. Jan's hairdresser later recalled finding her crying in her trailer after a particularly intimate scene with Gable. When asked what was wrong, Jan said, "I'm pretending to feel something I actually feel. It's like dying in reverse." 2 months after Red Dust wrapped, Paul Byrne was found dead in their Benedict Canyon home, shot once in the head, a pistol beside his body. The official ruling, suicide. The unofficial whispers suggested something far more disturbing. Byrne's alleged suicide note read, "Dearest, dear. Unfortunately, this is the only way to make good the frightful wrong I have done you and to wipe out my abject humiliation. I love you. Paul. You understand that last night was only a comedy." The note was vague, cryptic, suggesting some sexual inadequacy or failure that had driven Byrne to take his own life. MGM's publicity machine spun it as a tragic tale of a man who couldn't satisfy his beautiful young wife, implying that Jean was the victim of a marriage that had never been consummated. But 3 people close to the situation told different versions of what happened that night, and none of them mentioned suicide. A neighbor reported hearing raised voices and what sounded like a woman screaming. The household staff claimed they'd been sent away that evening on Jean's orders, unusual since they typically lived on the property. And the studio's own security chief allegedly told a colleague, "We cleaned it up before the police got there. That scene was dressed better than any set on the lot." Here's what the official story never explained. Why would Paul Byrne kill himself just 2 months after marrying the woman he supposedly loved? Why did the gun found beside him belong to someone else, a fact that was noted in the police report but never investigated? And why did MGM send their security team to the house before the police were even called? The alternative theory, whispered in Hollywood's darker corners for decades, suggests that Byrne discovered Jean was pregnant and that he knew the child couldn't possibly be his. According to Jean's letter found in Gable's desk, she told Paul the truth the night he died. She was 8 weeks pregnant. The father was Clark Gable. She wanted to keep the baby, leave Hollywood, Start over somewhere she could be real. Paul's response, according to Jean's account, was immediate and chilling. You don't understand. You don't belong to yourself anymore. You belong to MGM, and they'll never let you keep it. The rest of the letter describes what allegedly happened next, a confrontation that escalated into violence, though Jean insisted she wasn't the one who pulled the trigger. Someone else was there, she wrote. Someone from the studio. They'd been following me for weeks. They knew about Clark. They knew everything, and they made a choice that night about which scandal MGM could afford to absorb. A suicide of a troubled producer? Manageable. A murder investigation involving their biggest male and female stars? Catastrophic. The letter continues. They told me I had 3 options. 1. Have the baby and lose everything. My career, my reputation, possibly my freedom if certain evidence about Paul's death came to light. 2. Disappear. Have the baby in secret, give it up for adoption, and return to Hollywood as if nothing happened. 3. End the pregnancy and never speak of any of this again. Jean chose option 3. Or rather, it was chosen for her. Inside the box were medical records, dated October 1933, from a private clinic in Pasadena that no longer existed. The records documented a procedure performed on Jane H. The doctor's notes were clinical, detached, but they told a story of complications, severe hemorrhaging, infection, permanent damage to the patient's reproductive system. There was also a receipt, a payment of $5,000 to the clinic, signed by someone identified only as LBM, Louis B. Mayer, the head of MGM. The studio had paid for the procedure. The studio had arranged for the cover-up. The studio had made Jean Harlow's most personal tragedy into another line item in their production budget. But here's the detail that transforms this from tragedy to horror. The medical records indicated that Jean was nearly 5 months pregnant when the procedure was performed, far too late for a routine termination, and dangerous enough that the doctor had written in the margins, patient insistent despite medical advice, proceed under legal duress documentation. Legal duress, meaning someone had forced this to happen, and the doctor was covering himself legally in case the patient died. She didn't die that day, but the damage was irreversible. Jean Harlow would never be able to have children, and the kidney problems that would eventually kill her in 1937. The medical records suggest they began with the infection from that botched procedure in 1933. For 4 years after Paul Byrne's death, Clark Gable and Jean Harlow barely spoke to each other. They appeared in one more film together, China Seas, in 1935, and the tension on set was unbearable. The chemistry that had made Red Dust electric had curdled into something painful and accusatory. Jean's closest friend, actress Kay Mulvey, later described finding Jean in her dressing room during the filming of China Seas, staring at a photograph of Gable with his wife. She told me that looking at him was like looking at a grave, Kay recalled. She said they'd buried something together that neither of them could ever properly mourn. Gable, for his part, threw himself into his career with almost manic intensity. He married twice more after Rhea, first to Carol Lombard, then to Kay Williams. He had 1 child, late in life, with his 5th wife. But people who knew him well said he never quite shook a certain melancholy, a sense of having been complicit in something unforgivable. In 1960, just weeks before his fatal heart attack, Gable told his closest friend, director Victor Fleming, "I killed 2 people in my life without laying a hand on either of them. One of them I loved more than anything. The other one I didn't love at all, but he died because of me. I spent 30 years building a career on playing heroes, and I'm the furthest thing from one." Phasing asked him to explain. Gable shook his head and said, "The people who need to understand already do. Everyone else is better off with the myth." After 1933, something fundamental changed in Jean Harlow. The platinum goddess persona became more pronounced, more artificial, as if she'd decided that since she couldn't be real, she'd be the most exaggerated version of the fantasy instead. She threw herself into work. She dated publicly and dramatically, relationships that always seemed just slightly performative, as if she was acting out what a movie star's love life should look like, rather than actually living one. She gave interviews where she sparkled and charmed and said nothing remotely true. But occasionally, the mask would slip. During the filming of Reckless in 1935, she broke down on set and told director Victor Fleming, yes, the same Fleming who was Gable's confidant, that she felt like she was haunting herself. Fleming asked what she meant. Jean said, "There's a version of me that should have existed, a life I should have lived. Instead, I'm just the ghost that shows up to play the part. By 1936, Jean's health was deteriorating rapidly. The kidney damage from the infected procedure was progressing, but she kept working because work was all she had left. She got engaged to William Powell, hoping maybe this time something real could emerge from the performance. But her body was giving up. In her final weeks, delirious with uremic poisoning, Jean allegedly called out for two people, her mother and Clark. She never used his last name, just Clark, over and over, like a prayer or an accusation. He didn't visit her in the hospital. He sent flowers instead, with no card, no message, just white roses. The same flowers she'd carried in red dust during the scene where her character admits she's in love, despite knowing it will destroy her. Here's what makes this story particularly cruel. Everyone knew, or enough people knew, that the silence was a collective choice rather than ignorance. Studio heads knew. Directors knew. Certain journalists knew but couldn't publish because they'd lose access to the studios. Actors knew, but stayed quiet out of fear or complicity. The entire machinery of Hollywood Golden Age glamour was built on these secrets, not just John's, but dozens, hundreds of others like it. Women who were forced to terminate pregnancies to avoid contract violations, men whose sexuality had to be hidden and sanitized, people of color who were kept out of leading roles entirely. The studio system wasn't just a business model, it was a regime of control that extended into every aspect of performers' lives, including their bodies and their futures. Jean Harlow's tragedy wasn't unique. It was template, and the fact that we romanticize that era, that we get nostalgic for old Hollywood glamour, means we're choosing collective amnesia over uncomfortable truth. The real scandal isn't what happened to Jean. It's that the system that destroyed her was so successful that we still celebrate its products without acknowledging its brutality. When Clark Gable's grandson finally opened that envelope in 1987 and discovered the photograph, the letter, and the vault key, he faced the same choice that had plagued everyone involved: tell the truth or maintain the myth. He chose silence, or more accurately, selective disclosure. He shared the discovery with a few trusted historians, all of whom agreed that publishing the full story would accomplish nothing except damaging the reputations of people who could no longer defend themselves. The photograph was eventually donated to a private archive, cataloged but not displayed. The letter remains in the family's possession, unread by public eyes. The medical records were sealed again, their contents known to only a handful of researchers who've signed non-disclosure agreements. This might seem like another cover-up, but perhaps it's something else. A recognition that some truths are too private, too painful to be transformed into public consumption. Jean Harlow never had the luxury of privacy in life. Maybe the last kindness anyone can offer her is to let some of her pain remain her own. So here's what we're left with. A photograph that proves Jean Harlow was pregnant. A letter that suggests Paul Byrne's death wasn't suicide. Medical records that indicate MGM paid for a procedure that ultimately killed her. And Clark Gable's lifelong silence that speaks louder than any confession. We have fragments of a story that no one wanted told, preserved by accident and guilt, hidden in locked drawers and safety deposit boxes, known to enough people that it couldn't be completely erased, but protected by enough powerful interests that it never became public truth. Jean Harlow died at 26. The child she might have had would be 91 years old now. Clark Gable died without ever publicly acknowledging what happened between them. MGM became part of larger corporate mergers, its secrets absorbed into filing cabinets and eventually digitized into databases that no one searches because no one knows what questions to ask. And we're left with the platinum goddess in her silk gowns, frozen forever at 26, smiling that mysterious smile that we now understand differently. Not as seduction, but as survival. Not as invitation, but as erasure. Here's the question that haunts this story. If you knew that loving someone would lead to their death, would you still choose to love them? And if you survived that choice, could you ever forgive yourself? Clark Gable kept that photograph for 50 years. Jean Harlow carried the consequences in her damaged body for 4 years before it killed her. And somewhere in the gap between those two numbers is the real story of what Hollywood cost the people who built it, not in money or fame, but in futures that never happened, and children who were never born. The platinum ghost never got to be a mother, but she left behind something almost as haunting, A question about what we sacrifice for the stories we tell, and who pays the price when we choose the beautiful lie over the ugly truth.